When Bishop Baker and I were planning this conference with Mayor Bell, and initially we thought it would be very good to have several panel discussions. And we want to involve you, our participants, in this process as well. The first of those is going to happen right now. It's a panel of civic leaders. And then tomorrow morning, our very first session at 8:30 in Brock Forum, just near our building, will be a panel of religious leaders, an interfaith panel. And so these will be two very important parts of this conference. To lead us out in this panel discussion, I want to introduce Dr. Jonathan Bass. He is a professor of history. He is the university historian working on a history of Samford University. He's the chair of the Department of History. He's the author of the Pulitzer Prize nominated Blessed Are the Peacemakers, Martin Luther King Jr., 8 White Ministers, and the Letter from Birmingham Jail. He's a wonderful colleague, an outstanding historian, and he's going to come now and introduce the panel and lead us in this discussion. Professor Jonathan Bass.
Thank you, Dean George. Thank you for that introduction. In 1963, Martin Luther King wrote about one of the tragedies that he saw in Birmingham, Alabama. And that tragedy, this one that he singled out in his letter from Birmingham jail, he was lamenting the fact that he knew none of the 8 white ministers he addressed his letter from Birmingham jail to. And he said it was a great tragedy that we are only engaged in monologue on issues regarding race. And that's what I think is so important about being here today. And I think Bishop Baker and Dean George and all of the folks that have worked so hard to organize this, that we are truly engaging in meaningful dialogue on race. And I want to welcome our panelists here that are also helping us with this dialogue. Let me set a little bit of context for us about what we're going to be talking about, and then I'll introduce you to the panelists that you have not met yet. And it just begins with the simple question: what does it mean to be a civil leader? The quest for a civil society is at the foundation of Western civilization and thought. From the ancient Greeks and Romans to the Enlightenment and to the American experience, leaders have sought to bring about a more civil society. But we've often struggled with this concept, especially in dealing with civil society and race. Through a civil war and a civil rights movement, we've struggled. Almost 50 years ago, at the end of the activist phase of the civil rights movement, and almost at the end of Dr. King's life, he asked a very simple, direct question: where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? We're still trying to answer that question in 2016. And during these times of increasing civil unrest and disorder, and unfortunately a declining civility, it's all the more important for us to try to find answers. The practice of leadership in civil society is an important characteristic of an effective democracy. Such leadership teaches people democratic skills so they can gain both a sense of usefulness and a fuller appreciation of community. Such experiences can also hone the faculty of judgment, which is essential both for leadership in civil society and critiquing civil society. The major point is that those who want to create or sustain a flourishing democracy should value and seek to promote leadership in civil society. So helping us discuss the role of civil leadership in a civil society are our distinguished group of panelists. You already know Mayor Bell, Mayor Riley, Attorney General Strange, but joining them are two very distinguished individuals. The first is one of the finest jurists in the state of Alabama, and that is Judge Helen Shores Lee. Judge Lee was appointed to the circuit judge of the 10th Judicial Court of Alabama by Governor Don Siegelman in January of 2003. Prior to her practice of law, Judge Lee served as a magistrate for the city of Birmingham. Judge Lee also practiced law in the Birmingham community for several years in the firm of Shores and Lee prior to her judicial appointment. She is a graduate of Fisk University in Nashville. She also received her master's in clinical psychology from Pepperdine University in Los Angeles and her Juris Doctorate from Cumberland University here at Sanford University. She's a member of the American Bar Association, Alabama State Bar, Birmingham Bar, the Magic City Bar, and the National Bar Association. Joining her as well is Chief A.C. Roper of the Birmingham Police Force. Chief Roper was also born in Birmingham and attended Birmingham Public Schools. With over 30 years of law enforcement experience, Roper has worked for the Montgomery and Hoover Police Departments prior to becoming Birmingham's Chief of Police. In Hoover, he was promoted through the ranks, serving as a patrol officer, narcotics detective, traffic sergeant, training coordinator, operations bureau commander, and investigative bureau commander before being appointed assistant chief of police. So he has truly worked his way up the ranks. In November 2007, Chief Roper was appointed as Birmingham's 33rd Chief of Police. In this position, he commands the largest municipal police department in the state with over 1,100 full-time employees. Chief Roper has a Bachelor of Science degree from Troy University and holds a Master's of Science degree in Criminal Justice from the University of Alabama and a Master's of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. And we thank all of you for being here to participate in this. Since Mayor Bell is going to have to slip out for another engagement, I want to start with questions. I really want y'all to engage in dialogue with each other, and we'll have time for the audience to ask some questions as well. But I want to know, how do you define civil leadership, and what do you see your role as mayor as a civil leader?
Well, civil leadership is about service to the community, service to whatever entity you're involved with. I sit here next to my friend Judge Lee, and I was thinking about his father, who was part of a large political organization called the Jefferson County Democratic Council. And years ago, when I first wanted to get involved in the political arena, I decided to run for city council, and this is back in 1977. I didn't have any roots in the community other than I lived in the community, but I was not actively involved, but I wanted to be. And in that 77 election, I lost terribly. But there was a gentleman by the name of David Hood, Attorney David Hood, who was the president at the time of the Progressive Democrats, and he invited me to come back to a meeting that they were having. And after they went through the formal process of the meeting, he called me up and said, now here's a young man who's offered himself for political leadership, but we want him to understand one thing, that you've got to crawl before you walk, you got to walk before you run. Now, while you listen to my words saying you got to crawl, that doesn't mean beg, but you have to go back into the community and serve that community in whatever fashion that the community needs assistance and help in. And he said, by walking, when you're given assignments, carry out those assignments to the best of your ability, no matter what that assignment might be. And in terms of running, he said, now, if you're deemed to have a political career, the people will tell you when to run. And that's what he meant by crawling, walking, and running. Out of that meeting, he assigned me to an organization called the North Pratt Civic League. And the next at the time, I must have been about 27 years old. Don't try to figure out how old I am now. But I was about 27 years old. And he assigned me to the North Pratt Civic League. The next youngest person in that organization was 71. So there was a big gap there. And my assignment was every Saturday morning to get this old beat-up van, gas it up, and go around taking senior citizens to the grocery store, to the drugstore, wherever they needed to go. That was my crawling phase. Later on, I was a sophomore in law school, and I had the highest education of anyone in that particular civic league that I was working with. All of them were down-to-earth, good-hearted, blue-collar people, and they had some property in the area, and they had two parcels of property that they wanted to build a community center and a daycare facility. Because I was in law school, they said, he can figure out how we can do this. I had to go and search the titles. I had to go and do all the legwork. That was an assignment that they had given me of great responsibility. They ended up building that civic league out in the Pratt City area and the daycare facility up in the Eden Ridge community. Well, when they saw that I was dedicated to whatever task they were given, the '79 election came along, and they asked me if I would run to give them a voice on the city council, and I won that election. But it taught me the meaning of service. Oftentimes, when you think of a leader, you think of someone who's at the top and give orders down, but actually it's someone at the top who listens to the people that they serve below them and try to figure out the best course of action to accomplish the goals that they set out. And so anyone who wants to get involved, whether it's civil leadership, leadership within your school, leadership within your church or community, you've got to be willing to serve and not just automatically go in and think that, well, I know what's best for the group, therefore I should lead, but be willing to serve. And those within that organization or whatever will determine how far they will allow you to go in terms of your leadership ability.
Thank you. Go ahead and slip out if you need to. All right.
I want to tell William before you leave, William, I drank from the water fountains, the white water fountains. I also removed the board on the bus that said colored only, white only. I was a hard-headed child. I didn't like being told what I could and could not do. I don't like being told that today. But anyway, I just want you to know that before I left.
Thank you all.
See you soon, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor Bell. Mayor Bell mentioned David Hood, who at one time was the only black lawyer in Bessemer, Alabama. And I believe at one time Judge Lee's father may have been the only black lawyer in the entire state of Alabama. And I want to turn to her, and she has so many wonderful stories and so many accomplishments in her own right and the legacy she carries on from her father, Arthur Shores. Asking you, how do you define civil leadership, and what do you see your role as a civil leader, as a judge?
Okay. In my opinion, we all have to become more civically involved in the community. Far too long, we have left it to others. We come home from work, we go and maybe get a little bite to eat and sit down in front of the television, and that's it. There are a lot of opportunities in the community for you to serve and become civically involved in your community. And I'm going to say this to the young people out there. Although you're in high school now, you need to find an organization in the community now that you can become civically involved in. Another thing we need to do is to teach our children about our history. Because if they don't know the history, they're doomed to repeat the history. And let me tell you, the train has already left the station in terms of Voting Rights Act. I think Shelby County filed a suit a couple of years ago. It went before the Supreme Court, and the court removed Section 3 of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. That section talks about getting permission before you draw district lines. And now the state of Alabama and any other state can draw the district lines and just draw you outside of them if they want to. 50 years ago, we called that gerrymandering, and Attorney Fred Gray handled those suits. But today, our kids don't know their history. I went to Altamont High School to talk on, it was the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was also the 50th anniversary on the March on Washington. So I talked about those two events, and the only question, one of the only questions that came from the audience was a young man, about the 6th or 7th grade, stood up and asked me how old was I when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Apparently, he didn't understand the rest of the message. But one of the things I learned from my family and my father was to always give back to the community. Give back to the community. I never dreamed that I would be where I am today. Because when I was growing up in Birmingham, pursuing the American dream meant that you dodge bullet shots through your windows every day. It meant your house being bombed twice, with a third attempt before my mother found the dynamite in her garden. It meant being called ugly names. It meant having to fight for equal pay and equal rights. So my childhood was not a very pleasant childhood growing up. As I say, I didn't like being told what I could and could not do. So I was always in trouble when it came to the laws of segregation. I moved signs on streetcars. I drank out of the white fountain, only to get home and get a whipping from my mother, because she said I knew those things were wrong that I was doing. But the crowning experience for me, and I have Attorney General sitting here on the thing, but I think the time limit is up. Sitting on the front porch one night, my family had just moved to Center Street. As many of you recall, if you were white, you lived west of Center Street. Blacks could not live. Blacks lived on the east side of Center Street. So we built a house right on the corner of Center Street on the west side. We were sitting on the front porch one night, and this car of white youth would drive up and down the hill and stop and jump out the car and act as if they were going to rush the front porch and do something, only to go back and get in the car and drive off. Well, they kept doing it, and of course, knowing my disposition, I'd get up and call them names back. I'd holler and scream back at them. My dad would say, "Chickadee, if you would just sit down and be quiet, they'll go away." But they didn't go away. They kept doing it over and over and over again. I knew where my dad kept his Colt 45. So I got up and went in the house and got it and waited for them to come back down the street. And they did. They jumped out of the car, and I stood up and I aimed and I fired the gun. But my dad saw me, so he hit my arm, deflecting the shot in the air, and told me that, "Helen, you know, if you were to hit and kill one of those boys, that there would be nothing I could do to keep you from going to prison for the rest of your life." I decided then and there that I would not live anymore in Birmingham, Alabama. God had forsaken this city, in my opinion. So I moved on to college and to California, where I stayed a number of years. Now, young people, there's a lesson to be learned in all of this. Never say what you're never going to do. I said I would never move back to Birmingham, and of course I'm here today. So my family left me a legacy of involvement in the community, being active and involved. And where you see racism as it exists, don't be afraid to call it out, to call out racism where you see racism exist. A lot of people think that we have moved on. We haven't moved that far because racism still exists in our city and in our state today. It doesn't make any difference whether you are a hawk or a dove. We are all still flying around in the same environment. So being involved in educating our youth to their heritage would go a long way in facilitating positive thoughts about each other.
Thank you, Judge Lee. Chief Roper. Talk about your role as a police chief and as a civil leader, and then also who do you look to as a source of inspiration in what you're doing?
All right, so this civil leadership aspect is extremely important to what we do every day. As the moderator was asking the questions, I was thinking about the best definition of leadership I've ever heard. And still remember, I learned as a 13-year-old freshman at Phillips High School right here in Birmingham. And they taught us that leadership is the art of influencing people in such a manner as to gain their willing obedience, loyalty, and respect and cooperation in order to accomplish the mission. I learned that at 13. Now I'm a little older than 13, and I still remember that. And for civil leadership, I think we have to do all of that, this leadership, which is influence. We're asking people, we're asking our officers to influence their environment, influence their communities, influence those locations where they show up, where they're called, for the better good of our society. I think, me personally, and I talk to a lot of police chiefs, but I think we have an over-reliance on police officers in our society now. I think when families are failing and government in some aspects aren't doing what government needs to do, I think when other institutions are failing, there's an over-reliance on police officers. And quite often we call police into situations where if the communities or the families were stronger, we wouldn't need the police there. And so we have this over-reliance, and so quite often some of those situations take a negative turn, and the question becomes, why was the officer there? Well, the officer was there because quite often the family had no one else to call. So the Attorney General mentioned this mental illness issue. It's sweeping our nation. Well, there are no 24-hour mental illness response agencies. So when the uncle stops taking his medication and gets out of control, they call the police because they have no one else to call. And so civil leadership for us is get in there. We try to provide the best training, the best policies. We're a nationally accredited police department. In a month, I'll be in St. Louis to pick up our 9th national accreditation. We were the first national accredited police department in the state of Alabama, which speaks to the quality of our policies and our leadership. So we're asking our officers, whether young or old, to get in there, use your training, use your skills, and do the best you can to improve the quality of life for that citizen.
Thank you. Mayor, I'll ask you a similar question. Who have you looked to as a source of inspiration in your career as a mayor? And also, how can an average citizen get involved and make a difference as a civil leader?
Well, I look in many directions, and I was mayor of Charleston until 11th of January, so I'm no longer the mayor. But I would look to the citizens, the inspiration of good citizens engaged in the community, the progress that it is made in a community. I mean, the city has a role, but in the freest society in the world, and the country that showed how democracy can work, we also showed that freed people normally willingly take on responsibilities to address a problem and make it better. And so I don't, as mayor, wouldn't have to look very far in my community to find inspiration from citizens who are giving examples of civil leadership, and oftentimes just through the way they lead their lives, you find so inspiring. And then I believe that reading history is very important, and I learned lots of leadership from reading about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman or others, because the principles were all there. They were exacted or in different manners or different ways in different times. And then I think there's some others who mentioned a leader, and a citizen leader, elected official leader, is somebody who is helping move from the status quo. Just not be satisfied where you are. Get your entity or your community or your country to a better and more just place. And then the second part of your question,
How can an average citizen
the average citizen, a plethora of ways, you can do through your church and service organizations that your church provides in your neighborhood. We have 108 neighborhood councils in our city, and what those people do, or the soup kitchen, or helping with the scouts, or they're so. All you have to do is just look and listen, and you find ways to serve. And as mayor, I was always serving. I helped found our soup kitchen and shelter for the homeless with a group of ministers. I served as chairman of the United Way and head of the fundraise drive and everything. And the thing that we all know about service is this, community service, that it makes you feel better. I would never go to a meeting as a volunteer and not leave that meeting feeling better than I did before. So the joy of giving and the joy of serving is huge, and all you have to do is look around. The opportunities are plentiful.
Thank you. Attorney General Strange, looking out over the audience, I see a good bit of gray hair, some white hair, some no hair, but there are quite a few young people out here. In your role, and certainly struck me in your comments of how you see yourself not only as a civil leader but as a civil servant, how would you encourage young people to get more involved in developing civil leadership skills?
Well, I'm always encouraged by the involvement of our young people. I had a chance to talk to a group of, these were Catholic students yesterday in Montgomery, and they were actively involved, having mock elections and arguing and everything. And I tried to impart a couple of the lessons we're learning today about be civil. You're not going to always win every election. You don't have to be an enemy of someone just because you disagree with them. That's the beauty of our country. I tried to explain to them a little bit about the rule of law, the roles that we all play as different elected officials. We all have a different role. People ask me about things all the time, say, what in the world, why are you enforcing this law? And I try to remind them, the beauty of America is we're a nation of laws, not of men. We can change the laws. We have the best system in the world to do that. But we don't get to pick and choose. Chief Roper and I don't get to decide when we get out of bed, well, I think I'm just not going to worry with this one today. I'll just focus on this other one. And that's the beauty of America. That's what makes us so great. That's what protects all of us and our liberties. But I do everything I can at every opportunity to encourage our young people to get involved. And that's how I got in politics, in student government in college. And then I took a long time off. I wanted to start helping friends. And then that led me, kind of pulled me into it. But you don't have to run for office to be involved in the system. You just need to be knowledgeable. And I think we've all made that point. I wanted to say, the mayor took my one piece of advice that I give to every young group of young people, and that is to read as much history as you can, learn history. If you want to learn about why the other person's taking the position that they are, you should read a little bit about what they think or who they admire, and you'll maybe understand their perspective. And I've tried to do that in my life. If you read, you can pick any American leader, pick any president, pick any, and you will find that they endured many crises. They were tested. Their faith was tested. They were, and how did they deal with it? What did they learn? How did they get through it? And that's a huge value to me, to look back and remember that anybody that serves in public office is going to be challenged, and it's how you deal with it that really matters.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for a few questions, and then we'll come back and I'll ask another question here as we conclude. And I want to see if anyone has a question for our panelists. See, Mr. Pounds, I believe you have the microphone.
Good morning. My name is Richard Dickerson, and to Judge Lee, you mentioned racism still exists. And I think if you would expound upon that a bit, because I think that race does matter, and racism is an ongoing problem. And Mayor Riley talked about the need to get at it. And I think too often there is a desire to sugarcoat things and use euphemisms, but this still is a very segregated city. We've been here 15 years. I've lived all over the country. Yes, changes occurred, but there's a lot to be done. And it's not only segregated on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, but Monday morning at 9:30 in our offices and institutions and foundations across the city. So I'd appreciate your comment on that, Judge, or anyone else.
Institutional racism is rampant in this community. I can give you some examples of the court where there's discrimination among black and whites in the court system. I hear a lot of workman comp cases, and I hear a white man can come in there with a dislocated shoulder and strain on his back, and he gets $150,000. I had one yesterday that had a torn rotator cuff and something wrong with his back, and he was offered $1,900, of which I didn't accept. They need to do a little better than $1,900. But you see it in the courtroom. I had a lawyer they were arguing, black and white lawyer were arguing, and the white lawyer said to the black lawyer, "Boy, where did you get your education from?" So it's still out there, very much.
Does anybody else want to tackle that question?
I'll take a stab at it, especially from the perspective of policing, because these are critical times across the nation in law enforcement. And one of the good things we have going right now in Birmingham with the police department is we're one of the 6 national sites for the Department of Justice Building Community Trust and Justice Initiative. And the goal of the 3-year project is to develop a playbook that will be used nationwide in policing. Because as the federal government says, there are some things that we're doing very well in Birmingham, and they'd like to replicate those. And we have our challenges because we're a large organization. But the initiative has 3 components which I think are critical for this discussion. And the first component is procedural justice. And that speaks to how do police departments relate to the community every day. So right now we're sending the entire police department, every sworn officer is attending a 16-hour class just on procedural justice. The second component is implicit bias, and that speaks to this discriminatory practices, all those types of things, because implicit bias is all about a person may not be overtly racist, but sometimes there's subconscious processes that are going on beneath the surface of a person's brain, which results in disparate outcomes. So how do we work our way through that, where quite often when you start talking race and racism, it's hard to have that conversation because it's so sensitive. So how do we work through it where we're not saying someone is racist, but there can be some thought processes from the way they were brought up, the way they were raised, the environment they were taught in, that may lead to disparate outcomes. Because what we don't want is an officer, as the judge just mentioned, for that to be an example where, depending on the race of the person, the outcomes were totally different, even though the facts of the case were exactly the same. So, and then the third piece of that is racial reconciliation. Especially here in Birmingham, law enforcement we have a troubled history through the civil rights struggle, and we have to own that. So as a chief, as I go around talking to community groups, I have no problem saying we got it wrong. We were on the wrong side of history throughout the civil rights struggle. We apologize for that. It wasn't me personally, it wasn't the officers that are working here today, but it is the organization that we represent, and the organization got it wrong. And we want to do everything we can now to have good relations, but community relations has to be purposeful. It doesn't happen by accident. You have to really work at it every day, because trust is hard to build up, but it's easy to destroy.
Just in case this is the only police department related question, and I agree with everything Chief Roper said, and we got the fabulous department and fabulous chief in Charleston, and working on those kinds of things as well. And one of the challenges in America is the challenge of enhanced quality law enforcement training. Obviously, the officers in Ferguson, didn't have that, and I think our states and our national government, any way that they can encourage that, and to get local law enforcement agencies enhance the level of professionalism and the ethics of respect and justice that the chief talked about. But one thing that we do need to do in our country right now is this. There are lots and lots and lots of police officers that serve our communities and do it well. And they put on a badge every day, and most of them have a gun, and they go out to make us safe. And families are nervous. There are an awful lot of guns out there, and there are a lot of bad people out there. And so I think, the police profession is unnerved isn't the right way, but they feel this feeling out there, and so I think it's so important. I told a great nephew of mine who's working on a merit badge about this. I said, among other things you can do is whenever you see a police officer, walk up and say thank you for your service. Because they do, this is a hard time for them. The bad guys in Ferguson, scarred their profession, but they're out doing the best they can, and most of them are very honorable, so a pat on the back, something we all can do, would be very helpful.
Thank you. Another question.
Hi, my name is Arthur Price, pastor 16th Street Baptist Church. And I want to I'm glad to see we have police chief, we have a attorney general, and the judge and the mayor on the panel, all contributing to law enforcement. I think I'm on good ground by saying that God instituted 3 institutions: the family, the government, and the church. And one of the things that was striking to me, Attorney General Strange, is that you said that this didn't have to do with race, but there were 4 components that you thought that went into a person going into the criminal justice system. And I think you said there was a breakdown in the family. There was also a breakdown in the family. You said there was a breakdown in the family, poor education, drugs,
and moral.
And moral. The moral compass was eradicated. And if that is the view, and most of the people that are arrested are African American, that can play into the psyche of why the criminal justice system have the feeling that they have towards African Americans, because a lot of times we want to say that African Americans don't have a moral compass, and we don't talk about the systemic stuff that go into why there's no male in the home, why there's poor education. Even in this Jefferson County that we live in right now, we have so many different school boards here where people are not have the privilege to have a good education, but yet and still to say what you said and don't think that relates to race. But most of the times we'll say that for an African American person who's in the system, but when a white person in the system, we'll like to rely on the fact that it was a mental health issue. Can you kind of reconcile why you don't think that race plays into that?
Well, I think, as I viewed and looked at the statistics and everything, I think those 4 characteristics are really not racial. They're just facts of society that we have to deal with. If you look at the different categories of crime, we can slice it and dice it. The majority of the criminals are white offenders. But we just have to acknowledge that I think if we address those issues, we certainly have to address the issues in the inner city. Chief Roper can tell you, that's what his initiative is aimed at. But as Attorney General, I just don't distinguish between and I didn't mean to imply that mental illness was just a white thing or something like that. It's really just, these are just what I see across the board, and I think fellow AGs in other states see as well. Yeah, I don't have any jurisdiction over Bernie Madoff. But Richard Scrushy, yeah.
Another question.
Good morning. David Owens from Bishop O'Connell High School, chair of the religion department. I teach senior theology. And Bishop Baker is my mentor. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. And he invited me down last November when the USCCB came to Baltimore for their conference. As a Catholic educator and someone who has come through Catholic schools all my life, from the elementary school all the way through Mount St. Mary's, which fired its president, by the way, or he resigned recently. But my concern is this. As I see the students, the sophomores from Holy Family here today, John Carroll, here today, and my concern is teaching the children the truth. I say it all the time, and I heard at least 3 of you today talk about knowing your history, but so many of them do not. And as a Black Catholic, they don't know the history and contributions of people of color to our faith.
And they don't care to learn.
Well, that's why we're out there, and that's why I do what I do with the help of great mentors to try to get them this education so that they understand. The next point I'd like to hear is the gentleman that spoke about the verbiage we use when referring to young, especially Black males, African American males. The perception, I'm a city guy, is that they're a certain way. I tell the young people, older people are afraid of you. Have a conversation. Engage them in a conversation. And likewise, as president of my neighborhood association, I say to them, officer, you need to engage young people and have a conversation instead of fussing at them all the time. Engage them in a conversation. Bring them into your world instead of keeping them at arm's length. This is part of the issue when we have the dialogue. Lastly is respect. I tell my students, respect given is respect received. If you want respect, give respect. Any of those young people sitting in front of y'all today will tell you that one of the worst things you can do to them is disrespect them. If they feel disrespected, you've lost them. But we have to open up to them as much as we want them to open up to us. This is where we are, ladies and gentlemen. And I've seen it happen in Charleston. And I'm learning more about Birmingham. And Judge, I need to speak with you, because you're living history. You know, there are not many of you left here. We need you to speak more. Come on up to Baltimore.
Once I come off the bench, you'll hear me loud and clear.
Chief, you want to talk a little bit about community relations and how you're instructing officers and interacting with especially young black men?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the interesting things and one of the most challenging things and one of the most rewarding things that we have the opportunity to do, policing in an urban environment. I was born and raised in Birmingham, lived in all 4 police precincts, so I know the city pretty well because I've walked these streets. For those who don't know my story, my 19-year-old brother was a murder victim in Birmingham, so I know what families go through when they get that phone call. And so that motivates us to really work hard at it every day. But this community relations piece is something that we've championed ever since we've been chief. And so people who live here know that we're out walking in the communities, we're knocking on doors. So the Attorney General mentioned one initiative that we have in our violence reduction program where we work at identifying, and it's normally young men up to this point, who are more likely to be involved in a violent crime. And we call them in for a meeting, not to arrest them, but to offer them help. And we tell them, listen, if you continue down this path, you're either going to be a suspect in a homicide or a victim of a homicide, and we don't want either. So here's a 24-hour number that you can call that's going to be answered by a man who spent 36 years in prison. And his only purpose in life now is to prevent you from going there. So what can we do to help you? If you need job skills training, if you need counseling, those fines that you have, so when you see a police car riding down the road, you hide behind a tree because you know you have some active warrants on you. What can we do to help you work those out? And so right now, we just started last year, but we have almost 30 young men who have taken us up on that offer. And they're trying to change their lives, and we're working with them. But now we've taken it another step farther. And this you don't see in the news. But now we go knock on doors. And so as a police chief, I knock on the door and I say, ma'am, I need to speak to your son and I need to speak with you. He's come on our radar and we're very concerned about him. I've seen grandmothers and mothers start crying, not because they're scared, but because they're happy that the chief of police is standing in the living room, me and my staff, to say, we've come to get your son. We want to get him on the right path. And it is absolutely amazing. So we're doing more of that almost every week. We're knocking on doors. For the local people here, you may have saw the story a couple of weeks ago. That it's the power of social media. I was pushing a car in the street. I was in my police uniform pushing a car of a lady who ran out of gas. So I took some criticism for that because people were saying, why is the police chief out there pushing a car? Well, I'm a public servant, and I do it again today. But the reason I was in that community was because we were knocking on doors, trying to claim our young men and keep them from going down the wrong path. And so all of that is helping us to build trust in the community. There's a lot more that we're doing, and we have a lot more plans. But I think it's vitally important, and what we're stressing to our officers is not just what the police chief says, it's what you do every day. Because if you're rude on a car stop, it doesn't matter what I say. When that person drives away, they think about that officer was rude, and that was a Birmingham police officer. And so we're working extremely hard at it, but we have some ground to cover. But I think it's perfect for this day and time because we can't be successful without community support. We've got to work together. to improve the quality of life for our citizens. And we have amazing men and women that are working at it every day.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bruce Gilbert, the father. I am blessed to be the father of these beautiful children, and to my lovely wife, Gina. And I would certainly like to first give thanks to Bishop Baker, who we met last summer and had the privilege and honor to be invited to take part in this wonderful event that we share here today. I will bring a different perspective, a perspective of the Northeast, born and raised near Philadelphia in a small town called Easton, Pennsylvania. I was raised by my grandmother and grandfather, who came to the Lehigh Valley from a small town you may have heard of called Cuthbert, Georgia. It's actually spelled C-U-T-H, but they don't say the, they say Cuthbert, Georgia. And my father worked 44 years for the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, went in as the labor gang member and came out as an electrical engineer after 44 years of service, working second shift, 3 to 11. I knew what time to be at home, because if that car came down the driveway and I wasn't in, not just in bed, but asleep, there was trouble that was going to happen. And although they had struggles growing up in a small town in Georgia with one church and you name it, just a very small town. I believe it was called Piney Grove Baptist Church, where they were married and both grew up. They never really spoke to me growing up as a child as of those struggles in terms of what I would face in the world to eventually be a member of a biracial family where I have a lovely Italian wife, grew up Baptist, but upon marriage, her being stronger in her faith, and I kind of went every couple Sundays that I'd be called from home, Brucey, you're going to go to church, or Christmas and Easter. My wife remained strong, therefore I became Catholic 28 years ago, took my rights, and now practicing Catholic as my family. And you know, my parents were like, son, we are so pleased that you attend Mass and you go to church every Sunday. There's no denominations in heaven. And never, ever did I hear of any division or any talk of there's separate issues, although there were issues at hand. Fast forward the clock, I became the first black elected to the Northampton County Council and became the director of finance, and was risen to being chosen by the executive to be the chief of finance, or the financial director for the county, at which point I ran into my first real big smack of, well, maybe I've gotten to a level that they don't want me to go beyond. Number one, I'm a practicing Catholic. Number two, I'm a conservative, and that doesn't bode well in our press sometimes in the Northeast, especially if you're the complexion that I am. But that didn't stop me from continuing to forge ahead, even though I received the call stating that, unfortunately, we're just not going to, from one gentleman who was within my party, allow a black man to be our director of fiscal affairs. And I said, I appreciate you being honest with me. I do consider that our line in the sand, but you'll never see anything less than professionalism on my part, because as a retired banker and public servant now, as an adjunct professor of finance for DeSales University, I would never let something like that come into play as to how I treat my fellow man. You know, I heard a lot of talk about what we face in terms of racism as a minority, but part of that, when we've talked about, comes from that family dynamic. For instance, that is so crucial, the breakdown of the American family. You know, although I know that my sons and daughters probably fear this young lady much more than dad, because mommy is our true boss, I try to lead with character and with performance in how I portray ourselves in the public. When you're looking at the family dynamic, we have a responsibility as a people, of all colors. Now in Easton, we are a complete mix. We've been a mix since I was a kid, of Italian, Spanish, Lebanese, Syrian, black and white. We've always been a mix. Heavy Italian culture didn't have that in-your-face issue of racism. We had one or two incidents that would, people would say that's why it happened, but not a whole lot did we see it. Much more of it was masked, cloaked, where the subconscious talk that our chief of police here had mentioned, it comes out in your actions, but it wasn't something that you were forwardly thinking. And we know that that's a battle that we have no matter who we are, no matter what culture we come from. Someone's going to see some type of a difference, and if it doesn't come down to our race, it comes down to how big our feet are or what type of clothing that we're wearing. There's always something because we're human. Now, the only way to correct it that I see is proactivity. It's proactivity on all of our parts. We have to ingratiate ourselves, especially you young people today. I wish I could still say I was a young person, but I am not. But the young people today, if we ingratiate ourselves into a proactive mindset that I might not be there, but what I'm going to do is go there right now. They're going to see my face. I'm going to be in this. This is the arena in which I choose to play, so I'm going to form an internship. I'm going to go tell them this is what I'd like to do, and you'll see the person's face go, wow, really? This is a young man. This is what you'd like to do? And you'd be surprised how welcoming people are. Then you have a chance to have them get to know you. Get to know your history, because it's not about what someone can give us or do for us. Ultimately, it's about the service that these fine men and women up here have been talking about. To serve it's a privilege. To be able to serve my county as a councilman was not something that I felt like, you become this or that. It was a privilege to walk down. Just like the chief, it was a privilege for him to push that car. He didn't look at that as something out of his character, even though he's attained a high status in his career. That's something he wanted to do. That's what we have to have the mindset of, well, I'm not pushing anybody's car. Okay, then how do we grow? How do we become strong if we don't take the smallest effort of serving our fellow man? And it doesn't even matter what your fellow man looks like. Your fellow man could be blue, green, or orange, but he is your fellow man. We're human beings. That means you have a responsibility to that man or woman to serve them in some capacity. For if you do not, the result is broken down things in your household, broken down families, fractured communities, and then people who do not communicate. So if anything, I didn't have as much of a question as a culmination of all the wonderful things that these professional men and women here have said and what these beautiful people out here have said. And I just appreciate the privilege of being able to come before you with my family, who I love with everything I have. Without my family, I don't know what I would be. I'm nothing without them. And and my community, I feel the same way about. And although I'm an East Coast person, I feel like I'm a community member of Birmingham this week that I've been here. You all have been a wonderful, wonderful host. What a great city you have. And if we stay proactive, men and women of all backgrounds, the only thing we can lead to is success here in this beautiful city. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you for your comments. We're out of time and I know we could spend all afternoon, but I know some of y'all are anxious to get to lunch. But I'm going to ask one last question, and I'd like Judge Lee to answer it. We'll loop back around to the question that Martin Luther King asked in 1967, and that is, where do we go from here? As somebody that is a child of Birmingham, a child of the Civil Rights Movement, somebody that has spent much of your life and professional career here, how do you answer that question? What do you encourage our young people? Where do we go from here in issues related to civility and race?
Well, for one thing, as I said earlier, they need to know their history. My 16-year-old, my sister and I penned a book with Denise George called The Gentle Giant from Dynamite Hill. And my grandson was 16 at the time. He asked me, did those things really happen or did you make that up? So they don't know. And getting involved in your community, I can't stress enough getting involved in your community. Find something that is your passion. even if it doesn't exist. Start it yourself and go after it and recruit your friends to work with you. And then when we see racism, like jokes or what have you, don't be afraid to stand up and speak out where we see racism exist. And helping one, like the chief said, helping the woman push a car that ran out of gas, helping one another, regardless of the color of your skin, helping one another until there's a plaque on the civil rights statue that says, I just think until we learn to see each other through the eyes of God, we will never see each other without fear and without prejudice.
Amen.